And there's Dale Willman. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are on this Friday. On this overheating planet, pandemic-wrapped planet still, I'm sad to say. There's still several billion people with a B who have no vaccination or at most one. And it's a planet wrapped in an infodemic. It's a planet that is now completely disrupted by the global impacts that are reverberating from Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. So with that in mind, we're going to have a little relaxed conversation about climate news. Rebecca Lieber from Vox is supposed to join. Nicola Broom from Reuters was going to be on, but had to drop out because of that thing called news. So here's Rebecca. Hold on a second. And Dale Willman, who is my partner in arms here at the Columbia Climate School, is here as well. It's great to see you all. Rebecca, it's been a long time. You were at the New Republic. I'm not sure. The last time I ran into you was years ago. How are you doing?
Great. Yeah, it's nice to connect again. Was it really that long ago?
I can't, yes, in COVID time, it's like forever, and also yesterday. So it's great to, I think we're going to kick off what's going to be a regular Friday kind of a jam to get all of your views on, what the past week or so was like, what are the things you've been working on, and a little bit of a peek at what you're thinking about going forward. There's several things on the horizon. June is when the UN, it's like the halfway party for the COP process. It's going to be in June in Bonn, which has happened for many years. A lot of people are going to be gearing up for the run to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. We have hurricane season. We have Washington's political nuttiness, and we have lots of news, which is what we'll start with. And Dale Willman he runs the climate media, the Resilience Media Project at Columbia too. If you haven't met before, Dale has worked in public radio and other forms of journalism for a very long time. Paul Vucin has been at Science Magazine for quite a long time now. You were at E&E News, I think, early on. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, so I've been at Science since 2016. I was at E&E, the Chronicle of Higher Education, before that.
And Rebecca, what was your journey? Was it the New Republic before? I'm just trying to remember.
I've had a lot of jobs. The New Republic was a couple jobs ago. I've been at Grist. I previously worked at Mother Jones, and now at Vox.
So everyone take a breath. It's Friday afternoon. And then think back, maybe we'll start with Rebecca. What's been on your plate? You had been covering ferociously, natural gas, among other things, or should we not call it that anymore? We'll talk about that. And I think some people from Environmental Defense Fund are coming on in a little while to talk about some of their work. But so what's been top of your list through the week, or something you noticed that you're not working on? When you think about the climate story, what's been front and center for you?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, lately I am thinking and actively working on a story around this Securities Exchange Commission rule that is in draft form around disclosures on climate risk. So I've been looking at some of the industry pushback there, but also the arguments why, mostly for why this is like really important step if we're going to expect more from the financial sector on climate change. That's also, I think, especially timely because we're in earnings season for oil companies, and also seeing a lot of shareholder resolutions being introduced centered around climate at all sorts of companies. So that was actually a story I wrote last week. It feels like ages ago, but how a resolution requiring more disclosure from big banks that actually was voted down by quite a big margin. So we're not going to see voluntary climate disclosures anytime soon based on those resolutions. But I think it's just this growing story of where the activism is headed. And then I guess I'm also I'm definitely paying attention to what's happening on energy and gas bills and the oil industry right now. Obviously, things are changing very rapidly given the situation in Europe. And the last few months, I've been trying to make sense of like what's the noise, what also fact checking some arguments that we've seen from both industry, Republicans, and Democrats that kind of sugarcoat what's actually happening in energy markets. So I've been particularly interested in what's happening also with, I don't like to say the word natural gas, which we can get into, but for methane and gas, people's gas bills, what's actually going into why those bills have been so high, and also how people's consumer bills are actually tied to some of these climate denial efforts that companies participate in. So quite a big plate at the moment of things I'm looking at.
Yeah, I recently did a couple of webcasts, and I can't even remember if I wrote about it. The hearings, there was a hearing that, oh gosh, not Sheldon Whitehouse. There was a recent hearing where this pattern emerged where both the Republicans and Democrats basically got their talking points out of the same hearing, even though it was a Democrat-run hearing, because the Republicans used that time and space as it was on well, yeah, it was about gas, where the Republicans were saying they focus on prices, they focus on it was about forced electrification. That was the term the Republicans were using on this committee, which feeds beautifully into their Fox-ish ecosystem. And the Democrats were doing their thing too. So I don't know.
Someone
That
should
whole
tell them.
Washington realm seems so screwed up that way. What were
Someone
you going
should
to say?
tell them about rural electrification.
Maybe.
Yeah, the Democratic, just the talking points around what's going on with oil and gas has just been all over the map. I don't think Democrats have really coalesced around a singular talking point here, though I think there's been more momentum around talking about windfall profits and taxing that, especially given that oil companies are posting really big earnings this quarter. But I think like almost overnight, like climate kind of dropped from the agenda to become this strange like vortex of even Democrats arguing like, why aren't oil companies drilling more on their leases? So it's been a messy few weeks.
Yeah, and we have Mark Brownstein and Steve Hamburg from the Environmental Defense Fund are in the green rooms. There are some beers in the fridge there, guys, and there's some peanuts on the shelf. And you can come in. Yeah, I'm going to bring you in a couple of minutes to join the party.
Stay away from the green M&Ms. Those are mine.
Oh, okay. So Paul Vucin, you have focused. I'm not sure who I know else out there who has been brave enough to dive in on the basic science, like climate models, weaknesses, strengths. You just did a big piece on the Anthropocene, an issue close to my heart, but you actually were digging in on this idea of where in the world is this marker that scientists are going to find that will demonstrate to all that there's a layer of rock being formed right now that's our doing as a species. But I think the thing that's more important was the hot models. The IPCC has just had a big round of reports this year, and this stuff plays into the COP process. And could you just summarize quickly what's on your mind when you think about climate? Yeah, I know you're having a baby. Your wife's having a baby momentarily, so hopefully that won't distract too much.
The issue of prior to every IPCC round, you have this thing called the CMIP, where all the world's modeling centers run through all these different scenarios to feed into the IPCC, and then researchers around the world end up using these. I think you had 55 models contributing to this round. But back in 2019, there was a meeting in Barcelona. It first started to become apparent that a bunch of these models were kind of running hot, for lack of a better word. They had a climate sensitivity that seemed kind of out of the realm of normal estimates, like the typical range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius that kind of long been the standard since 1979. Initially, people weren't sure if this was just due to better understanding of the climate system or something more off in the models. But then a couple of years on, we've had these kind of better constraints on climate sensitivity happen. So we actually have a better feel of ruling out very low levels and also very high levels. And so, there's this kind of a consensus was formed that some of these models were just kind of producing results that just were kind of exaggerated with the best kind of scientific consensus. So going into the IPCC process, this was a big challenge, and they eventually kind of made the decision to look at the models, take the ones that did the best job of estimating climate sensitivity, use those to kind of produce a assessed warming projection, and then use all of the models, which were still quite skillful in many other ways, to kind of produce estimates at 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, things like that. And that worked really well. I was very impressed with how they were able to handle that. But that message to the kind of broader climate impacts community, who just uses the kind of general average of all these models, kind of got lost in the process. And so in Nature this week, this group put out this big warning and say, hey, you need to rethink how you're using these.
Yeah, and this plays into journalism because we all sit here and we get the climate impacts stories are built around, the projection ones at least, are built around, oh my God, the sea level is rising faster than we thought, or these heat waves are hotter than we thought. And if those climate impact studies are based on the hot models, then it gets complicated as a journalist. So this kind of becomes a feedback loop issue.
Yeah, I mean, it already exacerbates your kind of single study syndrome that I know you're not in favor of. And I mean, it's you have these, because in many ways it makes sense to use things that react strongly to increase CO2 emissions, because you can figure out the system, you can figure out sensitivities in the system. A lot of the reasons that scientists might want to do this don't necessarily converge with what reporters might be looking for in a simple story. And then also kind of prestige journals, might be looking to publish. So there are a lot of kind of mixed incentives in this.
Right. Dale, in your work, both in the past and in the training you're doing with journalism, when you look at the week's news, what do you see that excites you or drives you crazy?
Well, I want to comment on a couple of quick things here. What Paul was talking about, and it's not just the effect that it has on journalists, but it's the effect that it has on how people view science too. The public doesn't seem, capable is probably too strong a word, able to understand how science is done, and science is sometimes messy. And we have these advances and pullbacks, but when they see a pullback like that, they go, well, see, the scientists can't get it right. This is an incredibly complex issue. And the modeling's been going on for, 50 years or so. And they're much more robust than they were, but there's still issues that crop up now and then. And that's what science is about. It's disproving things. It's weeding these things out. But the public sees the headlines and they often go, well, you can't trust anything these guys say. When in reality, this is how it's supposed to work. This is the good stuff, that people challenge these things and find these outliers or these problems, and that's how science is shaped. But it's that complexity that's hard for people to understand at times. As human beings, we like simplicity. We like that what's right in front of us, and it's hard to think in systems. And a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been trying to get journalists to think more systematically and consider broad systems. And so the rising oil prices is another one of those things. I was talking to someone last night who was going on, and it's a big topic up here. The prices of gas, we're up to $4.40 something a gallon here in the North Country of New York, and people are pretty angry, and they're blaming the president, and they see no connection between that and what's happening in Ukraine, and they don't see any of the systemic stuff that's happening. The fact that Europe is pulling back, that they're trying to get rid of dependence on Russian oil by the end of the year. when a month or two ago they're saying, oh, we can't do that. We can cut back a little bit, but we can't do
which
that.
I think is one of the big stories right now is what will
Yes,
happen.
and long term, the effect that if they are able to pull out of all of that in a way that doesn't damage their economy long term, that allows them to shift to some other form, preferably renewable resources of some kind. If they can make that transition that quickly, the ramifications internationally are going to be huge. But all we care about is I'm paying, 75 cents or $1 more for gas right now, and I'm blaming somebody. It's going to be the president. It's just the inability to think more systems-wide, to understand all of this is a puzzle because the information's out there.
Yeah, I'm showing a cartoon I made using an 1884 political cartoon about Grover Cleveland navigating some issue back then, and I did plunk of Biden's face in the middle there. Because speaking of systems issues, I don't think I'd want to be the new press secretary at the White House, or I don't know how in the world they can navigate. He's flailing around with Putin's price hike messaging. And Rebecca, I brought in now Steve Hamburger and Ron, not Ron Brownstein, Mark Brownstein from the Environmental Defense Fund. We're going to talk about methane in a second. And I know you guys have both been watching Washington for a long time too. But Rebecca, switching out of your reporter's seat, if you were like in the White House, what kind of storyline do you think it's possible to put out there that would resonate with people? Is there anyone, or is it just like hopeless?
Wait, sorry. What is the question?
If you were not a journalist, but you were like in the White House, what kind of storyline could they possibly use, or what strategy makes sense? Thinking about climate and energy at the same time.
Yeah. Sorry, my voice just went because it
happens to me.
Wrong way.
All right.
Yeah. I guess. Let's see. I've never been asked that. I would put out, first of all, a coherent message around climate and response to Russia and Ukraine. I think they've done this a little bit, but I just think the messaging has been all over the map. This is exactly Biden's campaign platform point of boost domestic manufacturing, even mining. You can do this here, but there's a clean energy component. I think it's getting lost in this idea of a domestic oil industry that's patriotic, and I think there's a really clear kind of path for them to really drill into how clean energy can feed into energy independence. I know everyone on this call probably hates that term because it's a myth, but if you're asking me to put on the communications hat, I think you can make an argument this helps the U.S. Wean off of foreign oil, of course, if you just go all in on clean energy. I don't know if that's fully what you asked here. I think messaging on climate's been hard. They don't have a ton of success to point to, which is really difficult. Everything riding on Manchin has created this impossible situation for seeing real momentum move forward on climate. So it's really tough. They did just put out yesterday, Department of Justice working with EPA on this implementation of environmental justice and this 40% having 40% of infrastructure funds go to EJ communities. So they're clearly trying to create some momentum here. That's big news. That's definitely a step that's needed in order to see this actually happen and not just have this kind of float somewhere as a promise. So yeah, I mean, I don't envy the press secretary's job right now.
Yeah, and I've written about this. Obama was in the same trap back more than 10 years ago, where oil prices spiked, and I wrote stuff at the time about the same kind of impossible bind. He was also facing gas prices. He talked about the importance of not having what he called a shock to trance energy policy, and it didn't really go very far. But at least he had.
Oh, and just the whole Americans falling into this trap. Sorry, can you hear me? There's definitely this trap where, like, I think even reporters who know what they're doing around this fall into. Sometimes I catch myself kind of asking, well, what can Biden do about oil prices? And it helps. I did an interview this week with an expert at IEFA, and just the reminder when I asked a question that was some version of, well, can they be doing anything here? And just again, no, this is not something that's in the president's power, because we, as a country, as a world, have handed these energy decisions to private companies. So this is beholden to global markets, to their decisions on drilling. So I think, again, it's this straight, Biden's expected to show leadership here, but he also can't really do a ton in the short term when it comes to the prices people are paying.
I have one suggestion of what not to do when you mentioned this, Andy, about the White House. I suddenly flashed on Jimmy Carter in the sweater. So I would suggest that's one thing they really try to avoid, is that kind of imagery.
Well, now let's bring in our friends at the Environmental Defense Fund, Mark Brownstein and Steve Van Howard, both of whom I've known for a really long time. And you guys and EDF had really an interesting turn. It was more than a decade ago when EDF began organizing research on a key component of the climate system, the energy, the gas and oil infrastructure, and the emissions that come from that. And you took some heat early on, as I think you did way back in the 80s, you were working with McDonald's. You've always had this, through Fred Krupp, a really, what I felt is a very productive and constructive approach to go to the place where the problem is and work with people, and not be just all about litigation and regulation. And that's played out pretty powerfully. You've got, I don't know how many papers resulted from in the peer-reviewed literature.
More than 80.
The methane work. Amazing, and the only way you could do the measurements is to have companies cooperate and let you onto their facilities. So,
well, it's not
sometimes
totally,
yes and
Andy.
Sometimes no.
Yeah, we don't ask permission in a lot of our measurements. We do some of it that way, but we do a lot of it without anybody asking, and that's both on the streets of this urban environment now globally,
sure,
as well as in the oil fields of the U.S. and elsewhere.
Well, I know, and with remote sensing, I did a little work with you in the early 90s before I got into journalism full time. When I wrote my book on the exhibition at the Museum of Natural History that you were part of, and there at that time, the idea that EDF or any other NGO would be launching a satellite would be laughable. In 1992, it would have been laughable if someone said, "Hey, Greenpeace is going to launch a satellite or something," and here this is happening, right? So,
absolutely. High precision. It's not only we're launching a satellite, we've increased the precision with which we can measure methane from space when it goes up. So we'll see far more than we can with other satellites either planned or currently flying.
Is October still looking like the launch date?
We're going to be in mid next year, unfortunately.
Okay.
A little bit later. COVID supply chain issues impacted us like everybody else.
But, Andy, it sort of speaks to the conversation you were just having, in the sense that, what makes this moment different than prior moments, the Jimmy Carter moment, or even, Barack Obama 10 years ago, is where we are in the technological revolution. The options available to policymakers for zero carbon electricity because of the improvements in the costs of solar and wind are just, fantastically different than they were even 10 years ago. Electric vehicles, right? Where you have most of the major world's auto manufacturers now talking about transitioning away from internal combustion engines, maybe by 2035, maybe sooner. That was unthinkable 10 years ago because of the revolution in batteries. And if you think about our own advocacy around methane emissions, right, the technology has now gotten to the point where both in terms of the satellite technology, the sensor technology, and just the simple fact that civil society has the ability to put satellites into space. I mean, all of that is, in the last 10 or 15 years. So we're really because of technological innovation, we really are at a strategic inflection point that makes the opportunities to deploy climate solutions that much more viable. It's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, even though I know there's plenty of reason to be pessimistic these days. It's really quite fantastic.
And I would add to what Mark said is we also, sort of picking up where Paul was earlier, is we've realized that I like to frame it as we have two climate problems and we have two sets of solutions and we need to deploy both of them. So one is, what's the rate of increase in warming over the near time? And then what's the total amount of warming we expect to see over the longer term? And both of those drive impacts. And we have different ways, different opportunities to address those. And once we divide the problem up, we actually see with methane dominating, though not exclusively in that nearer term, and then of course CO2 in the long term, we have more options than we ever thought we had before to reduce the impacts of climate change. And so that gives us some reason to be, if not optimistic, at least more hopeful.
Andy, can I ask a question?
Of course. Yeah, this should be as much of a conversation as possible.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, just thinking on kind of fugitive emissions from fossil fuels. Obviously, the methane increase, also has this wetlands, our agriculture component, figuring out what's going on there with hydroxyl as well. How much do you think you can kind of curb that with, improvements on the industry fossil fuel side versus, gains elsewhere?
Tremendously. Because remember, yes, there are natural sources of methane. There are feedbacks most likely causing this increase with the climate changes causing wetlands to behave differently. But there's still the majority of those emissions are anthropogenically caused. They're human caused, of which fossil fuel represents a big chunk. If we largely reduce those by 75%, which is technologically and economically viable now, that's a big chunk. Will it totally reduce all increases? No, but will we be at a different level in the atmosphere? Will be much lower. And we can do it in ag, it's not as easy, and we can do it with waste. So that's 60%. Conservatively, the global methane pledge is 30% reduction. We can do 50% with what we know how to do today. So we've got to get on with it. Does it totally solve the problem? No. But does it make an enormous difference? Absolutely. And it makes a substantive impact on the rate of warming, right? We're going to greatly reduce. That's what's driving those impacts over the next few decades.
So is there one thing that bugs me? In 2009, Clifford Krause and I wrote a front page story showing how doable the leak reduction was. And there's been a ton of validation of all of that for all this time. And industry and its allies in Congress doesn't seem possible yet to put them in a position where they want to step forward and aggressively embrace that possibility. It's always foot dragging. Even now, from what I understand from the data, it's mostly really small players that are the super emitters. So it's like the Shells and BPs maybe aren't even in the driver's seat. So what's the pressure point here? You would think, especially now, it's a great time. If we had a different kind of government, I could see the president saying, okay, we're going to give you lots of more production rights, but you have to do it this way.
So it's, so Andy, I might say it's a little bit glass half full, glass half empty. Okay. And you've helped paint the picture of glass half empty. Let me take the other side of that for a second. So first of all, I think because of the field work that we've done, and frankly others have done, I think the recognition that this is a major both problem and opportunity has grown substantially. I mean, there's no question that we wouldn't be where we are today with 100+ companies have it committed to the global methane pledge at COP26 if we and others hadn't raised awareness both of the magnitude of the problem, but also the fact that there were tangible solution sets to be applied to it. I think that's number one. Number two is that the recognition that methane is a necessary strategy for addressing the climate crisis alongside decarbonization now is firmly understood and embedded in the IPCC in the global understanding of the science in a way that it wasn't when you were first writing about this,
Yeah, it's true.
10+ years ago. And it's because of your writing and others that, I think scientists, have taken a second look at this, and now there's a clear understanding in the science. But the third thing is that we have seen at least the beginnings of action. 12 of the world's largest oil and gas companies have committed to substantial reductions under a voluntary initiative called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. Those 12 companies represent 30% of global production, and they include, the usual suspects, Shell and BP and Total and others. And we have seen action. Canada has comprehensive methane regulations in place. Mexico actually has comprehensive regulations in place. Many of the key oil and gas producing states in the United States, beginning with Colorado in 2014, have regulatory standards in place. And the Biden administration, to their credit, has proposed a significant set of regulatory requirements, both for new sources and existing sources. And that proposal is due to be finalized, I think, by the fall. So that's all the good news. Now, the challenge, of course, is that, commitments and even regulations on the books are only as good as the mechanisms by which you have to hold people accountable. And so I think that's where all of the pioneering in satellite technology and aircraft technology and remote sensing comes into play, because I think that allows us to hold both companies and countries accountable for the commitments they make. Yeah. And I think that is the importance of, a project like Methane Sat. And then I also think that, we've got a lot of work to do to expand the universe of both companies and countries that are engaged. The United States is the world's largest oil and gas producer. We need to do more. The regulations that I talked about don't currently address flaring, which is a major source of emissions.
Yeah.
The regulations I'm talking about, and we can talk more about this, exempt 50% of U.S. oil and gas emissions because they don't deal with marginal wells. So we have work to do still in the United States, and plenty of work to do in other parts of the world as well.
Rebecca, I don't know if you, Paul, I'm not so sure your beat goes into this, but there's certainly, I think there was money somewhere about fixing up old wells, the what do you call them? Not just abandoned wells, there's a name, orphan, right? There clearly is there's a job boon here too as well. It's rural, which would seem politically salient. I don't know. We're heading into the midterms in big way. I guess I don't know if, again, is that a case that can be made, or is it just buried under all these other considerations?
Yeah, there's funding for abandoned well, which I think includes orphan wells in the infrastructure law, and I should remember it because I was looking at it this morning, but it's certainly not enough for the nation's, I think, like 3 million wells that need to be cleaned up. But I haven't seen, or I'm not familiar with like the jobs equivalent of what that creates. I think it's just there's so much going on in this election year, and just determining what does break through. Obviously, I think it's kind of hard to say what on climate will break through, especially when the Roe decision is hanging over everything,
Exactly.
and what kind of impact that could have. But one thing that I actually, oh, yes, thank you for pulling that up. Yeah, so this is actually, from what I've seen so far, states are falling over themselves trying to get this funding and plenty of other grants that are through the infrastructure law. This is really sorely needed funding that should have been available for decades, and what there is now is still not enough. So it's definitely, I think it's just going to show the need for funding this more thoroughly. But I hope to maybe this is a part question for the EDF folks on this call, because I did see that analysis, I think a few weeks ago, that looked at low producing wells and how those are actually responsible for, I think, over 80% of methane emissions in the
50.
US. 50. Okay. Still a substantial part. And I guess that, combined with some of the news we've seen where major oil companies are actually selling off some of their Permian Basin assets, and kind of this it's actually easier to regulate the larger companies. It gets a lot more difficult when you're talking about individual and smaller operators, because that's where the politics get dicier. So that's just something that I'm kind of have in the back of my head when we're talking about regulating and fixing methane leaks, of just how tricky getting all of this in patchwork regulation will actually be. So I was curious for your thoughts on that.
Let me jump in quickly, and then I'm going to turn over to Mark and just say, don't think of these marginal wells as just, somebody owning one or two. The bulk of the overwhelming majority of these wells are still large companies. They're not the majors, they're not the super big, but they still have a lot of capital assets. And the number of owners is largely the small number, but not the proportion. So yeah, there are a lot of owners with a very few, but they represent a small proportion of the total. So, and the thing is that people tend to say, oh, those are just on the margin. Just to clarify, that's 80% of the wells producing 6% of volume and 50% of emissions.
Amazing.
So, and that part of the problem is not getting attention. So just back to what Andy said, don't think about the big sources alone. They're very important. We got to clean up the big sources of methane. But this is a lot of small sources that add up to a lot of emissions, and we got to worry about those as well.
So on the regulatory side, I mean, this is exactly what I was talking about. So Rebecca, you're right to raise it. I mean, the proposed federal standards that are out there now, is as important as they are, fail to address this problem. And I guess the good news there is that the EPA has talked about a supplemental rulemaking, where they'll take a second look at this, and hopefully the work that we and others have done will help build the case that they really do need to take this step. We know that certain states like Colorado and New Mexico do actually work to address these more marginal sources. So as a practical matter, we do have examples where there are regulatory structures in place to address it. I'd say that here again, going back to the technological innovation piece, sometimes the biggest cost in abating methane emissions from wells is just simply going out and getting the information as to where the leaks are and how significant they are. And the cost of getting that information is coming down. It used to be that the only way that you could survey a well is to actually send someone out with an infrared camera and have them walk the site. And of course, that was time, and the cameras were expensive. And, if you think about a state like Wyoming, there's a lot of miles between wells. Well, now you can cover all of that, in an afternoon with an airplane. Maybe not even an afternoon, maybe just an hour. And that can give you the information you need. So instead of sending the person out to 100 wells to find the one leak, you can use the airplane to figure out which is the well that you need to send the person to, and take care of that within an afternoon. So these are the ways in which I think technology is going to help us make the case that not only is it important from an environmental point of view to get after these marginal wells, but in fact, it's cost effective, extremely cost effective.
And
there's
Oh, sorry.
There's a comment that came in from Chris Gassman at I think he said University of Pittsburgh, offering to collaborate with you guys.
No, that's super. I mean, and let me just say something about orphan wells. I mean, orphan wells, clearly they're important. They're important, for methane reasons, although perhaps not as important as, the marginal wells that we were just talking about. They're also important from a water quality standpoint. I mean, we need to make sure these wells are properly sealed for the, shut in for the purpose of protecting local water quality. So there's any number of reasons why we want to get after abandoned wells. But the focus on them should not allow us to be distracted from this problem, which I think is really, the heart of it for the U.S. oil and gas industry.
And before you come in, Andy, I'll just say, and we need to the point of all these orphaned and abandoned wells, we need to find them all. Right now, we don't have maps. We don't even know where they are, a lot of them.
So there's work to be done there for sure. What I was going to ask about is Cheniere and the idea of better natural gas, well, let's go with fossil gas. Let's stick with Rebecca's terminology, meaning Cheniere has pledged to do full supply chain, verification, so their LNG that goes out to Europe or elsewhere is up to snuff. Is that something you see technology playing a role in, or do you see this as some kind of greenwashy next wave, or where are we with that? And Rebecca and Paul and
I think the key to any regime that seeks to differentiate gas supplies has to do, number one, with comprehensiveness. So is there an assessment of the total universe of production facilities and pipeline facilities in a particular region? And are we working with real data, or is this all based on engineering calculations? We know from the 10 plus years of field studies that we've done, and Steve can speak to this in great detail, how inadequate the traditional methods of reporting are. The engineering estimates that historically have been used are woefully inaccurate, and so any certification scheme, whether it's for a company or a country, that's based on those reporting requirements, those engineering calculations is not very useful. And anybody can pick a particular site and a particular facility and turn it into their showcase facility.
Right.
And we've seen plenty of examples in our field studies of oil and gas facilities that perform very well. It's part of the reason why we know that the industry can do this, because we've seen plenty of examples of facilities that aren't emitting. But if a company is going to go out and say that they are a preferred provider, that they're greener on the basis of only doing a couple of sites or a couple of facilities, I would put that in the category of greenwashing. So comprehensiveness, real data, and right now we don't see that from any of the certification schemes that are out there. So can't say they won't be done or they can't be done, but we're not seeing it.
And one of the things I just want to highlight, a point that Mark made, was on this comprehensive. So because, as someone mentioned, right, these wells go on. If we take the Permian, there are a lot of wells that are 30 or 40 years old. They've gone through multiple owners. And so you can't just say, well, I don't own it, thus I'm not responsible. You develop it, and part of your business plan is to sell it off to someone else and get some of your capital back. Well, there's a contingent implication that goes along with that, because you developed it, whatever, and yet that can't be off the books. So we really have to think about this in a more comprehensive way. And as Mark said, none of the schemes deal with that, so that in fact you're just not segregating and putting a green stamp on the inherently cleaner portion of the population, and then leaving the dirty portion off to the side. And that's what'll happen. Your younger wells, meaning the more recently drilled, will have proportionally less emissions if operated reasonably well, and your older wells will have proportionally much more emissions.
So I want to turn this over to Rebecca and Paul and Dale, for questions and just your general thoughts on the state of the climate story, and not just the gas pains, but what are you thinking about going forward, or what are you not able to cover, or what are the issues you think have yet to be addressed that could make a difference here? And anything come to mind?
Well, sticking with methane, and I mean, there's always I don't want to give away too much of kind of future plans, but I forget which of you mentioned this possibility of there being a positive feedback in the methane signal, and I'm really curious I haven't seen anything definitive on that. That's a big scientific question going forward, and something I'd like to dig into.
Yeah, so I'll just comment a little bit. I mean, those feedbacks, the classic one people talk about is in the Arctic. There isn't right now a signal that I'm aware of in terms of concentrations of flux, and it's really about. So we'll have to see, but there isn't. I'm not aware of any evidence of that, and that's partially. We have to remember the good news about methane is that it's an energy source for microbes as well. So as long as you're releasing it into biological systems that have the capacity to respond, consumption can happen. I won't say it always will happen. And in the case of the tropical wetlands, the challenge is the temperature, right? It's not a direct feedback. The methane, everything else helps increase the temperature. The temperature regimes and the moisture regimes change, and that may change the microbial community and may change the biogeochemistry, which leads to more methane. So we have both the direct feedbacks and then the indirect feedbacks, and we're still exploring that. But the good news, if we think about if there is any good news out of the Macondo spill in the Gulf, is it emitted a lot of methane and oil, and very little of that methane got to the atmosphere, because in the Gulf, there's natural seeps. There's a biological community that consumes it, and while it wasn't instantaneously, it responded very quickly to consume a lot of that methane in the water column. So at least we didn't add that additional pollution source. It was a disaster in every way, but at least there was that response, natural biogenic response, biological response, which really kept it from being even worse. So in the Arctic, we're going to see some of that. The question is how much, and the question is to what degree will there be a feedback for methane emissions. But in the tropical wetlands, there's a lot of ground to cover. And I'm not an expert in it, but as far as I know, the literature is still really weak. We don't even have good quantification of those emission rates. So there are a bunch of people working on creating better field data collections there.
Let me also give you a political feedback loop, because methane is not only an energy source for microbes, it's an energy source for humans. And one of the things that I think actually helps square the circle between where we are today with the geopolitical crisis around energy and the climate crisis is the fact that keeping oil and gas methane out of the atmosphere is another way to actually increase natural gas supply available to the world's economies without drilling new wells. It's just simply about making more efficient use of the gas that we're already producing. Right. We did some calculations that suggested that of the 50 billion cubic meters that the Biden administration committed to Europe by 2030, fully half of that could be achieved if the United States reduced flaring here by 90% and venting and leaks by 70%. So we could actually provide, additional gas into the global economy by making more efficient use of the gas we're already producing. This isn't about drilling new wells. This is about not wasting the stuff that we're already extracting. The International Energy Agency talks about 180 billion cubic meters of gas from a 90% reduction in flaring and 70% reduction of leaks globally. To put that in context, Europe currently buys from Russia 155 billion cubic meters, right? So 180 billion cubic meters. So this is more than Europe purchases from Russia. That is every day wasted. And so there are ways actually to square the circle here, to do something about the geopolitical crisis that we find ourselves in and the climate crisis we find ourselves in, simply by making more efficient use of the resource that we're already developing.
Why is it that story is always so hard to sell? I mean, Dale brought up the sweater, the Carter sweater. but it's a proxy for. I've seen this over and over again. Europe. I don't know if you guys saw, but the IEA. This came up when I was researching Bill McKibben's idea for us mass producing heat pumps and sending them to Europe, which is, from what I can, at least to my judgment, it's kind of silly. There's many reasons why, but IEA said that if Europeans turn down their thermostats 1 degree centigrade, it's like 3.5 times the benefit of reduced gas as virtually everything else. It was in one of the Bloomberg stories.
Yep. No. Absolutely. I mean, conservation and efficiency, a large part of this. I mean, we can also make more gas available globally by accelerating deployment of renewables here in the U.S. I mean, so there are strategies that we can do. It does go back a little bit. Rebecca was talking earlier about, sort of leadership. One would hope to hear more about leaning into this crisis and seeing it as a moment to really do a strategic pivot. I mean, how many of us have lived through, the 73 oil embargo, the 79 crisis, first Gulf War, the second Gulf War? I mean, how many times do you have to see this movie before you know where it goes? So, at what point do you make the case that it's time to do something fundamentally different?
I would say a lot of the public are still not watching that movie, though. I mean, they're not as tuned in as we hope them to be. And I do think the message is much easier for conservation in Europe because, I mean, Russia is on your doorstep. It is, far more tangible than for your kind of average U.S. citizen, even with the higher gas prices.
Yeah, I think we've also, like the last decade of very low oil and gas prices, of just like absurdly low, to the extent of companies not making money. And I think people have a short memory. I think that is actually like a lot of people got used to that kind of world we're living in. SUVs certainly became more popular in that period. And we haven't taken these periods where there isn't a crisis to invest in the solutions that you need. So when there is a crisis, it's just these Band-Aids that don't actually address the full scale.
I've got a couple of things I'd like to bring up. One's relatively quick and just basic whinging on my part, but the idea that that businesses have forever called out the playing field. They define the playing field on these conversations, and so I never see journalists looking at that old adage that companies privatize the profit, but they socialize the cost of pollution. And so we're talking about a $1.5 billion chunk of the spending that's going to go to cap these wells, when the businesses who produce these, who create these problems, are basically throwing up their hands and saying, "Oh, it's an abandoned well, it's an orphan well. We don't have to deal with that anymore." So I'd love to see journalists doing more stories along those lines. I mean, we need solutions, but we also need accountability, and that's something that doesn't happen in this realm. And I would argue that some of that comes, this is the longer one, some of this comes from, when you look at the modern environmental movement, and I'm going to bring this back to the satellites with this. So you look at the modern environmental movement from the 60s, mid-60s forward, it led to a lot of change, but it led to massive technological change. So technology became the solution. We had tens of millions of people in the streets on the first Earth Day in 1970. And by 1980, they'd sort of disappeared because technology had taken over. So people didn't have to be engaged at the level that they were in the 60s and 70s. And I think a strong argument could be made for that. Now you're putting up this satellite, which just from the little kid inside of me, that's pretty cool. But also from a scientific perspective, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. We're still looking at broad technological things that, in a sense, might give the public the ability to say, "Well, that's well beyond us, so we don't have to be engaged." So, is there any effort, along with these large technological advances, to find a way to get the public more fully engaged. Because Paul, as you were saying, the American public isn't quite connected there, and in this case, it's because Ukraine's way over there, and we can go tisk and send some money, but that's all we have to do, and then complain about gas prices. But is there a way to more consistently bring the public in as a part of these technological things to be engaged on level and advocate or do whatever they might do in regard to these pretty entrenched and serious issues?
Well, the whole idea behind Methane Sat, and Steve can talk about his work with the United Nations on this, but the whole idea behind Methane Sat is really to make the problem transparent, right? To get the data, right? Methane is invisible. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. That's part of the reason why it has gone unaddressed for so long. Companies denied they even had a problem until we started doing our field research and we were able to show them the data. Methane Sat is about doing that on a global scale. And so part of the project is actually creating the data platform. It's not just about getting the information. It's about then creating the data platform that makes that data available to civil society, to investors who want to evaluate how different companies perform, to policymakers, and frankly, to industry itself. I mean, we want this, to the extent that companies are motivated to reduce their emissions, we want to help them. So everyone will have access to this information, and the whole idea is to create a data platform that makes this problem apparent and unavoidable. And Steve has been working with the United Nations to basically create a global clearinghouse for all methane information in an effort to serve that mission.
And that's through the International Methane Emissions Observatory. But I want to go back, because completely agree. I think, Dale, you're asking the right question. And so one of the things that also is part is doing the testing to understand how people perceive it, and not just average citizens. If you look at it, data isn't necessarily mean something to most of us, right? We see data. If you're not in the economics, you see economics data and okay, that's nice, but what does that mean? So one of the things we're doing is producing one policy relevant data so that it's actionable. You don't have to take any additional steps. It tells you something that allows you to take action. And then also having it so it's actually picked up. And we've done this in other cases with mapping methane leaks in the urban environment, and actually creating maps that people have looked at, reacted to, and we're making sure they're perceiving it using social psychology tools and others. It's not manipulative. It's just trying to understand, what are you seeing, and making sure that you're seeing what the data says and not something that you're interpreting that in fact isn't true. And that way we start to leverage it. It's not sufficient, but that's a big step towards the necessary. And that's an integral part of Methane Sat. It's an integral part of what we're doing at MEO through the UN, is to make that. And I want to just add to that, to your accountability. We've never had greenhouse gas data at a scale that was relevant to people and that was actionable. You can't go anywhere and see how much is being emitted by whom, where, and how. It's all general numbers, and it's not even direct. For CO2, there's no directly measured CO2 maps around the globe. Doesn't exist. And for methane, it doesn't exist, and we're creating it. And we'll be moving to CO2. That's a game changer.
By the way, shameless plug, permianmap.org.
Yeah.
Okay. Really? Okay.
If I could just jump in.
Yeah, of course.
Very briefly, on the, I think, both accountability front and also reaching people where they are and communicating on this. I know, like in my own work, a reason I've done a lot of work on talking about gas stoves and gas in buildings. And I think part of that actually came about thinking about people think about their energy as this distant thing that like it's happening somewhere in a field, we don't see it, and just like bringing it to where people actually are. So something like maps of cities of where there are methane leaks actually coming from our homes, coming from buildings, that I think really does start to hit home for people that this isn't just an abstract problem. I think once you realize like you have methane in your kitchen, it becomes a very different picture than thinking about this as some well out there in the middle of Western Texas.
So yeah,
we've
go ahead, Andy.
Well, I'm just going to show something briefly. This is still kind of a pilot project in Canada that I'm determined to do a webcast of the people who are running it. and they have a partnership with Google, and they have two different kinds of maps. One of infrared energy loss. Let me see if I could just quickly go to this. And one is of solar adoption. And these are in Edmonton, Alberta. And you're starting, I think, and this is a place I think where the media can play a role, not just through storytelling, but through helping to create these apps. You know, New York Times, many of you, Vox, I think, might have done some of this too, where you're not waiting for government or the like to, where you have data. This is data on sort of the heat signature.
Is this real-time data, or is this?
I doubt it's real time, but it's a snapshot at the very least. And so if you're in this community, you can start to understand, and you know, where the waste heat is. And I'm just using this as a proxy for what Rebecca was just saying. I think that many of these issues we could start to think about new ways of communicating that can really make a difference.
I'll put a shameless plug. We've done what Rebecca said. We've mapped 13 cities in the US. We have maps. You can see where the methane leaks were, how big they were, and you just go in and zoom in to wherever you live and see what they are. And now there's a private industry that'll map those for utilities, and some of the utilities are now making that voluntarily public. They originally said, "Oh, you can't make that data; it'll be unsafe, and people will call 911," and it didn't happen. But it was. One thing I'd say though, we have to really think through what our analogies are. So we were going to use the amount that it takes those leaks, use the equivalent of how many meals you could cook, and that led people to perceive it as dangerous explosions. Well, if there were any dangers in these leaks, we immediately get the crews out there, right? So any data that was posted has been addressed that way. We would never allow it to go up, you know, at the moment we have it. We did it actually, which was counterintuitive. I thought I would do it exactly as you said, Rebecca. We actually did it with miles driven because that was more neutral. It represented to people, it was climate change, it was impact, but it wasn't an immediate threat because these leaks weren't immediate threats because literally they, so the Permian map is the Permian, and then we have these other maps of urban areas on the EDF website. But that data, we need more of that data, absolutely, and we need to do it globally, and that's what the International Methane Emissions Observatory is all about, is bringing all these data sets together and making a portal for the globe so you can understand what's being emitted, how much is being emitted, what's causing it to be emitted, and how it's changing over time. And that's, I think, I believe, will be a game changer.
And on the basic science side, it's amazing how fast this has moved, right? I remember in 2016 covering from the AGU meeting the first detection of a CO2 plume with the orbiting carbon observatory. And you're now going to have MethaneSat, but also just this whole suite of hyperspectral imators going up into orbit that can pick up methane and CO2 plumes. And you know, this is NASA, ESA, private companies. Like we're going to be awash in this data in the next few years. So this is all going to be made very visible real soon.
Absolutely. And we will, another plug, we actually will be doing CO2 with MethaneSat as well. We don't talk about it, but we will have a CO2 product as well.
Pretty well. This is a pretty uplifting kind of closure for the hour. I'd like to have Rebecca and Paul and Dale, if you have one last thought, just like thinking ahead, or what was revealed here, you might start to jot a story around. That'd be cool. Then it is a Friday. We all still have work to do. So thanks for being part of this today, and we'll get Nicola back on here. I'm trying to make this a weekly kind of a gaggle. So any last thoughts? Maybe Rebecca and then Paul and then Dale.
Yeah, I mean, we should talk about all of this data collection, because I certainly want to do some more stories here. But yeah, I think just we didn't talk about it. This is for another week. But so much is hanging on court decisions around climate regulation. Obviously, the Supreme Court case coming up. I think a lot of the things we're talking about when we're imagining what can be done on climate, what can be done in a regulatory regime, there's this just question looming over of whether the government will retain that ability to do it. So that's certainly like forefront of when I'm thinking about these problems, that just what the landscape is looking like ahead.
That's a good one to put on the list for really soon.
Future week.
Yeah.
For
Paul?
For something that could be the literal polar opposite, I'm going to have a story going up soon on last one before the baby comes, on kind of how the delays from the pandemic are going to really linger in Antarctic science for the whole next decade, because access to Antarctica has been incredibly limited. Will continue. They're really stressed for resources, so some of these projects are going to continue to shift back to the right. Things like that might be drilling the western Antarctic ice sheet to discover when it last collapsed. That's moving back several years. Just these things at the poles are going to linger and linger on beyond all the many horrible human impacts.
And then throw in the fact that Russia's so disrupted too. They have a big chunk of Antarctica science themselves too. I'm sure that's part of the issue. Dale,
Antarctic science, yeah. I'm not going to throw out a story, but more the idea of actionable data. And for journalists, a lot of people covering environment are people who are generalists and don't necessarily have the background, especially at local outlets, don't have the background to really dig deeply into some of these things. So one of the things that I found useful when there is collections of data and other things like this is putting together essentially fact sheets and a way to walk journalists through a couple of story ideas of how they might be able to. I mean, people like Rebecca and Paul have no problem with this, but if you're talking to someone in Steubenville, Ohio, at the newspaper there, and they want to cover this, but they don't know how to go about it, if there's a sort of a fact sheet that says, here are a couple of examples of how you might localize this story for your community, I think that goes a long way to really boosting coverage of these issues too, because we need to get those who aren't steeped in this the tools to be able to report adequately on this, to get the public to better understand these issues. And I'd love to see that in this case. I think it's a really important aspect of getting this data out there.
One thing I'll just close out with is I just, a couple of days ago, I had Jigar Shah on here. He's the head of the Energy Department's loan office, who came in there after a very successful career in solar financing and stuff. And he threw out a statistic that blew my mind. First of all, he said there's 19,500 municipalities in this country. And he said every one of them is eligible for a chunk of the $45 billion that he was given by Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to dole out as loans for replacing school buses, dirty buses, with electric buses, for even replacing dirty police cars with Teslas, or for, he said, half the streetlights in America are still not LEDs. And he said this $45 billion with a B, that 19,000 local reporters, in all those little municipalities can be nudging their communities to take action on. And that feels to me like a really great and underappreciated story. Decentralizing the climate story, making it about those things, can take away that sort of paralytic thing that comes with scale. The climate crisis feels so overwhelming, but guess what? You can have cleaner buses. How about that? Let's start with that. And then that builds, and you share that information on social media with surrounding towns, and guess what? You've got something really moving. It's been great to have you all in here today. This is sort of an experiment. I did a bunch of these on COVID-19 with COVID-focused reporters early in the pandemic. And then I kind of lapsed, and Fridays I didn't have a regular rhythm, but now I think we will kind of make Fridays sort of a news gaggle, and identifying stories that aren't told and looking at ones that are told and seeing if we can go forward a little bit better each day and each week. Thanks to the team from EDF, Mark Brownstein, Steve Hamburg. Someday I'll see you guys in person somewhere again. And Paul Vusin, good luck on the home front with your second child about to be brought into this fast changing world, which I think we're all still hopeful about, despite the
Congratulations.
challenges.
Thank you.
Rebecca, it's great to reconnect with you, and fantastic work at Vox. It's great to see you there. I think it's a great fit. Vox is still a super place. So good luck with your work going forward. And Dale Willman, my partner in arms at the Columbia Climate School, who's doing our resilience media project, trying to build reporters' capacity to make preparedness and resilience a story. It's really hard. And so thanks to all of you. Have a good weekend for those who think about things like weekends. And this can be shared. Anyone watching now or anyone here, we can share this right now. As soon as we're done on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, it's there as an archive video. And that's the story. Thanks to the Columbia Climate School for helping make this happen. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take care.
Bye.